There is a knock at the door of your soul, and most people never hear it. It doesn't sound like hooves or fire. It doesn't smell like sulfur. It sounds like comfort. It sounds like a voice that finally understands you. It looks like a candle, a crystal, a gifted friend who just knows things, an app that reads your energy, a spirit guide who only ever tells you what you want to hear. Exorcists who have spent decades sitting across from the possessed and the oppressed will tell you the same unsettling truth. The deception rarely announces itself. It doesn't come wearing horns. It comes wearing a smile, a rosary, sometimes even a Bible verse. The most dangerous lie is the one that feels like light. For over a decade, ministries dedicated to deliverance and exorcism, the kind of work made famous through the recovery and study of the relics of saints, through Vatican-trained exorcists, through first-hand encounters with the demonic, have quietly documented a pattern. A pattern of ordinary people, faithful people, curious people who opened a door they didn't know was a door, a tarot card at a party, a harmless Uaha board, a psychic who just wanted to help, a meditation app that promised peace but delivered something else entirely. By the end of this video, you will understand the 6 warning signs that separate authentic spiritual experience from spiritual deception. Signs that exorcists have seen again and again in confession booths, in hospital rooms, in ordinary living rooms that became battlegrounds. Some of what you're about to hear will disturb you. It's meant to, because the first weapon against deception isn't holy water or incense. It's knowing what you're looking at. If you ask any experienced deliverance minister what the single most common misconception is about demonic influence, they will not say possession. They will say peace. People assume evil announces itself with chaos, screaming, violence, the stuff of horror films. And sometimes it does. But the far more common, far more successful strategy is the opposite. It arrives disguised as serenity, as clarity, as a sign that felt too perfect to be coincidence, as a warm, glowing sense that you finally found the answer you'd been searching for. This is not an accident. It's a strategy older than recorded history. Scripture itself warns that even light can be counterfeited, that deception's most effective form doesn't look monstrous, it looks beautiful. A false light, mimicking a true one, is far more dangerous than open darkness, because open darkness makes people run. False light makes people walk toward it willingly, gratefully, even joyfully. Consider how this plays out in ordinary modern life. A woman going through a divorce, desperate for direction, visits a psychic who tells her exactly what she needs to hear, that everything will work out, that her ex was never right for her, that a new love is coming. She leaves feeling lighter, comforted. Is that comfort real? Exorcists who have counseled people after years of psychic dependency will tell you the comfort is real in the moment, but it is manufactured, engineered to create a return visit, a deeper dependency, a gradual erosion of the person's reliance on prayer, reason, and their own God-given discernment. This is the first mark of spiritual deception. It offers certainty without the discomfort of discernment. Authentic spiritual growth almost always involves friction, moments of doubt, seasons of dryness, the hard work of wrestling with conscience. Deception skips all of that. It hands you an answer, gift-wrapped, no questions asked. And that ease should be the first thing that makes you suspicious, not the first thing that makes you relax. Deliverance ministers describe a second layer to this. The counterfeit peace almost always comes bundled with isolation. Not always obvious isolation. Rarely does anyone tell you, stop talking to your family. Instead, it's subtler. A slow reframing where your priest, your skeptical spouse, your worried best friend start to seem small-minded, jealous, or not spiritually evolved enough to understand what you've found. Meanwhile, the source of your new peace, the guide, the group, the practice, becomes the only voice that feels safe to fully open up to. This pattern shows up again and again in cases documented by exorcism ministries. A person begins with something that seems utterly benign, a wellness retreat, a spirit box app downloaded out of curiosity, an online group promising to unlock ancestral wisdom. Weeks or months later, that same person is having nightmares they can't explain, feeling an oppressive presence in their bedroom at 3 a.m., experiencing sudden rage or despair with no discernible trigger. When exorcists trace the timeline backward with these individuals, the pattern is strikingly consistent. The trouble began not with something that looked evil, but with something that looked peaceful. There's a reason relics, physical objects connected to saints, to holiness, to lives that were tested by real suffering and real spiritual warfare, and came through faithful, are treated with such reverence in these ministries. It's not superstition. It's a recognition that authentic holiness was earned through struggle, obedience, and often real suffering. Nobody who has lived a genuinely holy life describes it as an unbroken stream of untroubled peace. They describe dark nights. They describe doubt. They describe wrestling. Counterfeit peace, by contrast, is suspiciously frictionless. It never asks anything hard of you. It never calls you to change, to sacrifice, to examine your own faults. It simply flatters, soothes, and expands its hold. So how do you tell the difference in your own life right now today? Ask yourself, does this peaceful thing I've found make me more loving toward the people who challenge me, or less? Does it deepen my humility, or my certainty that I already have all the answers? Does it draw me closer to community and accountability, or quietly further from both? Exorcists who have sat with the oppressed for thousands of hours combined will tell you, by the time someone is in real spiritual trouble, they almost never remember choosing darkness. What they remember choosing was comfort, ease. A shortcut around pain. That is the first warning sign, and it is the one people are least prepared for, because we've all been trained, by culture, by algorithms, by the entire wellness industry, to chase peace above almost everything else. But not all peace is the same peace. Some of it is a resting place, and some of it is bait. If counterfeit peace is deception's opening move, counterfeit knowledge is its second, and it is arguably even more effective because it appeals to something almost universally human: the desire to know what others don't. Exorcists across generations have described this as one of the oldest hooks in existence, older than seances, older than tarot, older than any app on your phone. It is the promise, whispered in 1,000 different packagings, that says, you can know things that are hidden. You can see what others cannot see. You can have access to secret understanding that will finally put you ahead of your uncertainty. Think about how this manifests today. Horoscope apps that don't just entertain but genuinely guide decisions. Should I take the job? Should I trust this person? Is today a good day to make a big move? Tarot readings sought not for fun at a party, but as an actual replacement for prayerful discernment. Psychic mediums promising contact with a deceased parent or child, offering grieving people just enough uncannily specific detail to hook them into believing the connection is real. Online communities built entirely around channeling ascended masters or spirit guides who dispense wisdom nightly to eager followers. What deliverance ministers consistently observe is this: authentic spiritual insight, the kind that comes through prayer, through the sacraments, through the wisdom of trusted spiritual directors, tends to be humbling. It reveals your own blind spots. It calls you to change. It rarely gratifies your ego. Counterfeit spiritual knowledge does the opposite. It flatters. It makes you feel special, chosen, awakened in a way that others simply aren't. This is the second warning sign. Deception almost always inflates the self. It whispers that you are more spiritually advanced, more sensitive, more in tune than the ordinary people around you, including, often, your own church, your own priest, your own family. This isn't accidental. An inflated sense of spiritual superiority is one of the most efficient ways to sever someone from the very communities and authorities that might otherwise recognize the danger they're in and pull them back. There's a documented pattern exorcism ministries describe with eerie consistency. Individuals who begin experimenting with divination, Ouija boards, tarot, psychic readings, spirit channeling apps, as just curiosity or just for fun, and who then find themselves months or years later dealing with symptoms that have no medical explanation. Disturbed sleep, a sense of being watched, objects moving, a feeling of a presence that grows more assertive over time. When exorcists interview these individuals, a chilling detail comes up over and over. The practice that seemed most benign, a free tarot app, a fortune-telling booth at a fair, a Ouija board bought as a joke at a sleepover, is very often the doorway the person can trace the trouble back to. Why would something so small open a door so large? Because, ministers explain, these practices all share one thing in common. They are attempts to gain knowledge or power through means God did not ordain, bypassing prayer, bypassing legitimate discernment, reaching instead for a shortcut. And a shortcut, by definition, has no safeguards built into it. There's no confessional, no spiritual director, no sacramental protection built into a Ouija board. You are quite literally opening an unguarded door and inviting whatever is on the other side to answer. This is not superstition dressed up as theology. It's a consistent, cross-cultural, cross-denominational observation made by people who spend their working lives dealing with the aftermath. The specific mechanism matters less than the pattern. An appetite for hidden knowledge pursued outside of legitimate spiritual guardrails, correlating again and again with subsequent spiritual affliction. There's also a subtler version of this same hunger that rarely gets flagged as dangerous at all, because it wears entirely respectable clothing. The endless personal growth industry, promising, unlock your highest self, access your inner power, manifest your destiny. Strip away the marketing language and you find the same ancient hook. The promise that you, on your own, without humility, without community, without any real reckoning with your own weaknesses, can seize hidden power and bend reality to your will. Authentic spirituality, by nearly every serious tradition's own account, moves in the opposite direction. It asks you to surrender control, not seize it. It asks for humility, not mastery. It calls you toward dependence on something greater than yourself, not independence achieved through secret techniques. So here is the second question to ask yourself. Alongside the first, does this practice, this app, this guide, this teacher promise you access to knowledge or power that bypasses discipline, humility, and community? Does it suggest that you uniquely are ready for secrets others aren't ready for? If so, regardless of how spiritual the packaging looks, deliverance ministers would tell you that you are standing exactly where deception wants you to stand. Here is the sentence that unsettles even lifelong believers the most. Deception does not need you to leave your faith. It only needs you to slightly distort it. Exorcists who work within the Catholic tradition specifically are emphatic about this, because it's the pattern they encounter constantly, and it's the one people are least prepared to recognize. Nobody expects darkness to show up quoting the Psalms, but it does, consistently, across centuries. The scriptural warning that even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light is not poetic exaggeration. Deliverance ministers treat it as an operational description of exactly what they see. What does this look like in practice? A self-proclaimed healer who prays fervently, references Jesus constantly, and still somehow leaves people feeling drained, confused, or subtly worshipful of the healer rather than of God. A prophet whose predictions are wrapped in devout language, but who demands increasing obedience, secrecy, and financial sacrifice from followers. A mystic who claims private revelations that conveniently always elevate their own authority and never call them, personally, to greater humility or accountability to the church's actual teaching and structure. This is the third warning sign. Counterfeit spirituality tends to center itself rather than center God. Authentic religious experience, across the testimony of saints and mystics recognized over centuries, consistently redirects attention and glory away from the person having the experience and towards something greater. It produces humility, obedience to legitimate authority, and, critically, a desire to submit the experience to scrutiny rather than demand it be accepted on faith alone. Counterfeit experience does the reverse. It resists examination. It grows defensive when questioned. It positions the messenger, not the message, as the object of devotion. Deliverance ministers describe encountering this most often not in obviously fringe groups, but inside communities that look entirely mainstream from the outside. A prayer group that gradually becomes cult-like in its demands for obedience to a charismatic leader. A deliverance ministry, ironically, run by someone with no actual training or accountability, performing informal exorcisms that leave people more disturbed than before, not less. An online preacher whose sermons are laced with just enough biblical language to seem legitimate, while subtly teaching that ordinary sacramental life, ordinary priests, ordinary confession are no longer necessary because this teacher offers something more direct, more powerful, more anointed. There's a specific detail exorcists flag again and again. Legitimate spiritual authority in these traditions is never self-appointed and never unaccountable. A real exorcist operates only with the explicit permission of a bishop, under real oversight using an actual established rite, not improvised theatrics. The very structure, layers of accountability, formal training, ecclesiastical permission, exists precisely because unaccountable spiritual power is recognized as dangerous, even when it claims to be doing good. When someone presents themselves as possessing extraordinary spiritual authority without that structure of accountability, no oversight, no willingness to be questioned, no submission to any authority higher than themselves, that absence itself is treated as a serious warning sign, regardless of how sincere or gifted the person might appear. There's also a quieter, more insidious version of this same pattern that shows up in ordinary devotional life, not just in dramatic ministries. It's the slow drift from relationship to transaction, where prayer stops being genuine communication and becomes a formula believed to guarantee outcomes, where devotion to a particular practice, novena, or object becomes almost magical in the way it's approached, detached from the actual faith and humility it's meant to express. This isn't usually demonic in the dramatic sense. But deliverance ministers note that spiritually disordered practice, even sincere, well-intentioned practice, can create the same kind of vulnerability that outright occult experimentation does, because it trains a person to seek control and certainty rather than surrender and trust. So the third question to sit with is this: in whatever spiritual experience, teacher, or community you're currently drawn to, does it consistently point beyond itself, toward humility, toward accountability, toward something greater than the messenger? Or does it, in ways subtle or obvious, keep circling back to elevate the messenger, demand your loyalty specifically, resist your questions, and position itself as beyond the need for oversight? Deliverance ministers have learned, often the hard way, that some of the most difficult cases they ever handled did not begin with a Ouija board or a psychic hotline. They began in a pew, with good intentions, with real faith, gradually bent, degree by degree, towards something that still used all the right words while quietly rearranging where the devotion was actually pointed. Every experienced deliverance minister will tell you the same uncomfortable truth up front. The overwhelming majority of what looks like spiritual affliction is not. Anxiety, depression, trauma responses, sleep disorders, and a wide range of medical and psychiatric conditions can produce experiences that feel supernatural and are not. Responsible ministries insist, as a matter of both theology and basic ethics, on medical and psychological evaluation before ever considering something spiritual in nature. This isn't a caveat added for legal safety. It's a core operating principle, because treating a treatable medical condition as demonic can cause real, lasting harm, and because taking spiritual affliction seriously requires first ruling out everything else. With that essential caveat firmly in place, deliverance ministers do describe a cluster of patterns that, when they occur together, in combination with a clear history of occult involvement or serious unrepented sin, move a case from monitor and refer toward warrants deeper spiritual investigation. The fourth warning sign, then, isn't a single symptom. It's a convergence. Exorcists are trained to be deeply skeptical of any single dramatic symptom taken alone. What draws serious attention is a pattern, a documented history of occult practice, or a serious break with faith, combined with physical or behavioral changes that have already been evaluated and not explained by medicine or psychiatry, combined with an aversion, sometimes visceral, sometimes merely uncomfortable, to specifically sacred objects, places, or prayers, in a person who did not previously have that aversion. That last detail matters enormously and is often misunderstood by people outside this field. It is not simply, does the person feel uncomfortable in a church? Plenty of people feel uncomfortable in churches for entirely ordinary psychological reasons, unrelated to anything spiritual. What deliverance ministers look for is something more specific. A sudden, uncharacteristic, disproportionate reaction. Not discomfort, but genuine revulsion, agitation, or physical symptoms, triggered specifically by sacred elements, in a person whose relationship to those same elements was previously neutral or positive, and which cannot be accounted for by any diagnosed condition. Beyond that, ministers describe patterns involving sleep, not ordinary insomnia, but a specific recurring disturbance around the same time each night, often described by those experiencing it as a presence, rather than mere wakefulness. They describe sudden and severe changes in personality that don't fit any diagnosed psychiatric profile, and that emerge in close proximity to a specific identifiable event, often on investigation, an occult practice, a serious act of desecration, or a curse invoked by someone else. They describe an unusual and specific knowledge the person seems to have no ordinary way of possessing. Not vague psychic impressions, but startlingly specific information about people or events they had no access to. Here is the part deliverance ministers stress hardest, and it's the part most likely to get lost in a shocking retelling. The vast majority of people who come forward believing they are dealing with something demonic are, on careful and compassionate investigation, dealing with something else: grief, trauma, undiagnosed mental illness, sleep disorders, or simple fear feeding on itself in the absence of good information. Responsible ministries turn away or redirect far more cases than they ever accept for deeper investigation. And they do so specifically because they take the reality of genuine spiritual affliction seriously enough to not dilute it by misapplying it to everything frightening or unexplained. This matters for you watching this video for a very practical reason. If you or someone you love is experiencing genuine distress, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, unexplained fear, a sense of oppression, the responsible first step is never to assume the worst supernatural explanation. It's to seek real medical and psychological care, and alongside that, ordinary spiritual support, confession, prayer, trusted pastoral counsel. The dramatic cases you may have seen dramatized in films represent a tiny fraction of what deliverance ministries actually handle day to day. Most of the work is quiet, patient, and almost entirely about restoring ordinary spiritual and psychological health. Prayer, sacraments, community, professional care, not confrontation with visibly manifesting evil. So the fourth thing to hold on to is this. Don't let fear or fascination push you toward diagnosing spiritual warfare in yourself or others based on a single frightening symptom, a scary dream, or an unexplained noise in the house. Real deliverance ministers spend far more time gently ruling things out than dramatically casting things out. If something in your life genuinely concerns you along these lines, the healthy and courageous path is the boring one. Talk to a doctor, talk to a therapist, and talk to your pastor, in whatever order makes sense, rather than to an online forum promising quick answers. If there's one thing that frustrates experienced deliverance ministers about how this subject gets portrayed, it's this. Audiences want the dramatic confrontation, the moment of visible battle. But almost everyone who has done this work for decades will tell you that the real protection, the thing that actually keeps people safe, is unglamorous, ordinary, and almost embarrassingly simple. The fifth warning sign to understand is really its inverse, the fifth protection. Ordinary spiritual discipline, practiced consistently, closes doors that dramatic intervention later has to force back open. Prevention, not exorcism, is where nearly all of the real work happens, and it happens in advance, quietly, in lives that never make it into a documentary. What does this actually look like? First, and most emphasized across virtually every tradition of deliverance ministry, regular, honest confession or its equivalent, an actual practice of naming your faults to someone outside yourself rather than letting shame and secrecy accumulate in private. Ministers describe secrecy itself as one of the most consistent conditions under which spiritual and psychological trouble deepens. Whatever is hidden tends to grow. Whatever is spoken into the light to a trustworthy person tends to lose much of its power. Second, genuine community, not performed community. Isolation is, as we discussed in Part 1, one of deception's favorite tools, and the antidote isn't a large social circle. It's a small number of people who actually know what's going on in your life and who you've given permission to ask you hard questions. Deliverance ministers describe repeatedly seeing this single factor, real, accountable relationship, as more protective than almost any specific prayer or ritual, because it's the thing that catches problems early before they compound. Third, a disciplined, unglamorous prayer life, not sporadic, crisis-driven prayer, but the boring, daily kind. Ministers are consistent on this point, almost to the point of anticlimax. The people who find themselves in the deepest spiritual trouble are rarely the ones with a rich, ordinary, daily prayer life. They're far more often people who had let that discipline lapse, sometimes for years, and who then, in a moment of vulnerability, grief, loneliness, curiosity, desperation, reached for a spiritual shortcut instead. Fourth, and this one surprises people, intellectual formation. Knowing your own tradition's actual teaching, clearly and specifically, rather than a vague cultural impression of it, turns out to be a significant protective factor. Deception thrives on vagueness, on people who have strong spiritual instincts but shallow theological grounding, which leaves them unable to tell the difference between something authentic and something merely dressed in familiar language. The people most easily misled are very often not the irreligious, but the under-catechized, sincere, well-meaning, but never given the tools to evaluate what they're being told. Fifth, a healthy relationship with fear itself. This might be the most counterintuitive point in this entire script. Deliverance ministers repeatedly warn against morbid fascination with the demonic, against consuming endless shocking content, horror media, or true crime-style occult stories purely for the thrill of it. Not because curiosity is sinful, but because a mind marinated in fear and fascination becomes paradoxically more susceptible rather than less, more likely to misinterpret ordinary bad luck or ordinary illness as supernatural attack, and more likely to be drawn, out of sheer morbid curiosity, toward the very practices, tarot, Ouija, just for fun, psychic apps that create real vulnerability. And sixth, tying everything together, humility about your own certainty. The people deliverance ministers describe as hardest to help are not the ones who are confused and scared. Those people are, in a strange way, already in a good position, because fear and confusion make people seek help. The hardest cases are the ones who are absolutely certain they've found the answer, whatever that answer is, certain their psychic is right, certain their new spiritually advanced community understands things the church doesn't, certain their private revelations don't need to be checked against anything or anyone. Certainty, ministers note again and again, is one of deception's favorite disguises. Because it looks so much like faith while functioning as its opposite. Faith submits to something beyond itself. Certainty of this kind refuses to. None of this is dramatic. None of it makes for a thrilling scene. But if you ask people who have spent their careers sitting across from those in genuine spiritual crisis what they wish more people understood, it isn't learn to recognize a demon. It's this: ordinary faithfulness, practiced consistently in community, with real accountability and real humility, closes almost every door that deception is looking to walk through. We are living through what might be the most spiritually hungry and simultaneously the most spiritually unguarded era in living memory. Surveys across the Western world consistently show declining religious affiliation alongside rising interest in astrology, tarot, manifestation, psychic consultation, and various forms of New Age and occult practice, often among the very same demographic, sometimes even the very same individuals. People are not, broadly speaking, losing their sense that something beyond the material world exists. They are losing the institutional structures, the accountability, and the inherited wisdom that once helped them navigate that sense safely. This is precisely the environment deliverance ministers describe as most dangerous, not because interest in the spiritual is itself the problem, but because interest without discernment, hunger without guardrails, is exactly the combination that has, across every era they've studied, produced the most vulnerability. Add to this a digital environment engineered to maximize engagement rather than truth, where an algorithm has no ethical preference between showing you a grounded reflection on prayer and showing you a spirit box video, a curse removal service, or a charismatic self-proclaimed prophet, because both generate equal watch time, and you have a genuinely novel accelerant on an ancient problem. Consider the sheer accessibility of what previous generations had to seek out deliberately. A century ago, encountering a Ouija board, a psychic, an occult text required effort, a trip to a specific shop, an introduction through a specific social circle. Today, a curious 13-year-old can download a spirit communication app, join an occult-themed server, or watch hours of real paranormal encounter content, all before their parents notice, all without leaving their bedroom. The barrier to entry that once served, however imperfectly, as a kind of natural friction has essentially disappeared. Deliverance ministers who have watched this shift over the past 2 decades describe a genuine change in the caseload they encounter. Not necessarily more dramatic cases, but younger cases, and cases with a shorter and shorter runway between initial curiosity and serious distress. A generation raised with instant access to every form of spiritual experimentation. Absent the community structures and formation that once accompanied spiritual life, is a generation more exposed than almost any before it, and crucially, less equipped to recognize the warning signs we've spent this entire video laying out. This is why this subject, however uncomfortable, deserves serious attention rather than either of the 2 easy reactions it usually gets. The first easy reaction is dismissal, treating all of this as superstition unworthy of a rational person's attention, mental illness misdiagnosed by the credulous, nothing more. The second easy reaction is the opposite extreme, treating every strange dream, every bad feeling, every difficult season as evidence of demonic attack, turning fear itself into a kind of obsession, which, as we discussed in Part 5, actually increases vulnerability rather than protecting against it. The honest, difficult, unglamorous middle path is the one deliverance ministers actually walk, day after day. Take the spiritual dimension of reality seriously enough to protect it deliberately, through community, through humility, through ordinary discipline, while also refusing to be governed by fear, fascination, or dramatic misdiagnosis. It's a path that asks more of you than either extreme, because it requires actual discernment rather than a reflexive posture in either direction. So here, gathered together, are the 6 warning signs we've covered. 1. Deception offers peace without the discomfort of real discernment, and often arrives bundled with subtle isolation from the people who'd otherwise question it. 2. Deception inflates the self, promising hidden knowledge or power that bypasses humility, discipline, and community. 3. Deception frequently wears religious language, centering the messenger rather than pointing beyond itself and resisting accountability and scrutiny. 4. Genuine spiritual affliction is rare and always investigated alongside